And Roman number 2 is the structural design of living things. So the structural design is just the idea that most living things are built more or less in the same way. They have more or less the same structural design. And that structural design begins with the cell. So the cell is the building block of living things. There's different definitions. This is a very simple definition. All living things are made out of cells. Now, there are some scientists that will say viruses. I'm making this video in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. So viruses are on the forefront of everybody's mind right now. A virus is a tiny, tiny particle. It's a tiny structure, but it's not a cell. It's not as complex as a cell. And if we're going to say that the cell is the basic building block of living things, if we're going to say that all living things are made out of cells, then technically a virus is not a living thing. Now, viruses get into cells. They infect cells. They take over the machinery of the cell, and they use the cell like a factory to make more viruses. So once the virus has infected a cell, it's very much alive. And to say, I mean, some biologists will say that viruses are living things even though they're not made out of a cell. But technically, according to this classical definition, since a virus is not a cell, it's not alive until it infects a cell and takes it over. Now, cells are very small. If we want to say, how small are they? What's the word that comes to mind? Hopefully, microscopically small. Now, even though they're very, very small, they're still big enough to have even smaller things in them. So the smaller things that are in the cell are called organelles. So organelles are parts of a cell. And there's several, 10, 15, 20 different organelles. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. But again, I'm hoping all of you have been through this before in some biology class, and you know some examples of organelles, like the plasma membrane, sometimes called the cell membrane. It's an envelope that's around the cell, separates the outside of the cell from the inside of the cell. We'll go over the organelles a little bit more later on in another unit, so I don't want to get too sidetracked with the detail here. There's the mitochondria. That's plural. Mitochondrion, I-O-N, would be singular. People tend to remember that the mitochondria is the powerhouse. Powerhouse of the cell. But when I ask students why is it called the powerhouse of the cell, they don't know. So if you're memorizing these little phrases without knowing what they mean, that's limited value. It's not no value, it's better than nothing, but you really need to understand the things you're memorizing. So why do we say that the mitochondria is the powerhouses of the cell? It's because the mitochondria is where energy is released from, anybody know? Bobby? Frankie? Charlene? I can't see you, I can't hear you, I got no idea what's going on. Some of you are texting, even though I can't see you. I know some of you are texting. stop texting. Pay attention to the video. Energy is released from food. That's why it's called the powerhouse of the cell. That's where we get energy from. You might have heard of the nucleus, which controls the cell. Some people say it's like the brain of the cell. I don't particularly like to think of it that way. But the nucleus helps to control the cell. Can you think of any others? Anybody? Just raise your hand. Ribosomes. Can you see this still? Ribosome. What happens at the ribosomes? Protein synthesis. The ribosomes are involved with protein, P-R-O-T-E-I-N. Nobody can read my handwriting. Protein synthesis. Ribosome. Protein synthesis. Synthesis means you're making something. Protein synthesis means you're making protein. This happens on the ribosomes. You're making protein. Ribosome protein synthesis, we're making protein. Well, if you're going to make something, you need the raw materials to make it. What are the raw materials to make protein? Anybody know? Amino acids. So you can think of amino acids like beads. They come in 20 different colors. There's 20 different amino acids. Think of them like beads. Then the protein is going to be like a necklace. We're going to string these beads together to make a long necklace called a protein. Now pay attention to what I just said, because that comes up again and again and again, which is the idea that some molecules, a protein is a molecule. If you don't know what molecules are, we'll come to that when we get up to the chemistry unit. But some molecules are very, when you see me do this, I'm right there, it's telling me the time, 19 minutes and 5 seconds. So I'm trying to limit the videos to 30 minutes. We'll see how successful I can be. But there'll be several molecules that end up being like long necklaces, and as soon as I tell you that a molecule is like a long, this is my symbol for long necklace, the next thing I'll tell you is what are the beads that make up the necklace. Proteins, the necklace, amino acid beads, 20 different amino acids. I represent that by saying they come in 20 different colors. So the beads are strung together on the ribosome. It's like a factory or an assembly line where we're going to string the amino acids together, and that's why we say the ribosome is involved with protein synthesis. So I'm talking about some examples of organelles. I'll give you one more example. The lysosome contains that's an N, C-O-N-T, contains digestive enzymes. Now, if you don't know what an enzyme is, look it up. For now, I will be going over it later on, but for now, just get your own idea of what is an enzyme. You can just Google what is an enzyme, or you can look it up in the index of the textbook. Enzymes speed up chemical reactions. Digestive enzymes will be involved with chemical reactions where you're breaking something down, you're digesting it. Sometimes people say the lysosome is like the stomach of the cell. Materials or molecules in the cell can get into the lysosome, and the lysosome has enzymes that chop it up, break up the molecule. Those those are also organelles. So what have I told you about cells so far? And here's another example of me just repeating and repeating and repeating. Cells are the building blocks of living things. They're small. How small? Microscopically small. Even though they're very, very small, they have even smaller things within them. What are those called? Those are called organelles. I believe I've given you 4 examples of organelles. Plasma membrane, which could also be called the cell membrane, the mitochondria, the ribosomes, the lysosomes. There might have been another example I can't recall right now. The last thing to note about cells is there are different kinds of cells. In your body, in my body, there's different kinds of cells. In different kinds of living things, there's different kinds of cells also. So you might talk about plant cells and animal cells and bacterial cells, and those are different kinds of living things, and they have different kinds of cells. But we can also speak about different kinds of cells in one particular type of living thing. We are living things, human beings, and we have many different kinds of cells. We've got red blood cells, five kinds of white blood cells, three kinds of muscle cell, three kinds of bone cells, cartilage cells, neurons, what kind of a cell is a neuron? A neuron is a nerve cell. And the list goes on, and depending on what book you look at, here's over 150 kinds of cells in a human body. Over 150 kinds. So this is just a partial list. We've got red blood cells is 1, plus 5 kinds of white blood cells. 5 plus 1 is 6. 3 kinds of muscle cells, 6 plus 3 is 9. 3 kinds of bone cells is 12. Cartilage is 13. Neurons. So I've given you 14 examples of different kinds of cells, and the list goes on to over 150 different kinds of cells. Now, did I just say that your body is made out of 150 cells? No, there are trillions, roughly 30 trillion cells in your making up your body. And those 30 trillion cells come in 150 or 200 different types. So be clear, trillions and trillions of cells in your body that come in roughly 150 or 200 different kinds. So how big is a trillion? There's tens, 10, 20, 30, hundreds, thousands, 1,000. You take 1,000 times 1,000, you get 1,000,000. You take 1,000,000, you multiply that by 1,000, you get 1,000,000,000. You take 1,000,000,000, you multiply that by 1,000, you get 1,000,000,000,000. That's quite a big number. So that would be, if I had a 1 there, it'd be 100,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000, 10,000,000, 100,000,000. And if this is confusing, you just ignore it. 100,000,000, a billion, 10 billion, 100 billion, 1 trillion. 1 with 3, 6, 9, 12 zeros after it. That's a trillion. And I'm saying you got 30 trillion cells making up your body. That's a very big number. Don't be confused by the arithmetic. If it really bothers you, I mean, you should understand these words, but I don't want to make anybody sick, so maybe I've already made you sick. But I'm not trying to make you sick, so don't worry too much about those numbers. The idea is it's a big number. So we just finished the very first level, which is the cell. Next level is the tissue level. We call them levels. I call it cell level. The book calls it a cellular level. Now, a lot of books will have the chemical level. Cells are made out of chemicals. So the books will include a chemical level. The chemical level is not yet the living level. So that I skipped the chemical level. But it is true, your cells are made out of atoms and molecules, which are chemicals. So we can't talk about a chemical level. I skipped that. I go directly to the cellular or cell level. Then we have the tissue level. A tissue is a group of similar cells. Now, if you look at different definitions for the same word, you'll often see slight variations. I picked the simplest definition I can find. If you understand the definition, looking at 2 or 3 different definitions should not be a problem. If you understand what they mean, you should see, even though the wording might be slightly different, all the definitions would have to mean essentially the same thing. So a group of similar cells. Now, if we say that there's 200 types of cells in a human body, how many types of tissues could there be? Can you figure that out? Because you should be able to. If we say this, I said it's 150 to 200 types of cells. If we pick a specific number, 200, we say there's 200 types of cells. If a tissue is a group of similar cells, then how many types of tissues could there be? Could be 200 types of tissues. So if you had a group of the first kind of cell, let's say you had a group of red blood cells, that would be the first type of tissue. If you had a group of one type of muscle cells called skeletal muscle, there's skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. 3 different types of muscle cells. If you had a bunch of skeletal muscle cells, that would be the second tissue. If you had a bunch of neurons, that would be the third tissue. If you had a group of the 200th type of cell, that would be the 200th type of tissue. So there's lots of different types of tissues, but the number I'm going to focus on is the number 4. We say there are 4 main categories of tissue. I'm not going to go into detail. We have a whole unit on tissues, but I at least want to list the 4 main categories of tissues. Epithelial tissue, epithelial tissue covers things like your body is covered with skin, and the outer layer of the skin is epithelial tissue. It lines things. It lines hollow structures, hollow organs. It forms glands. Again, we'll go back over this when we get up to the unit on tissues. Epithelial tissue is sometimes called epithelium. Second type of tissue is connective tissue. I'm not going to say too much by way of definition for connective tissue, but I do want to give you 6 examples of connective tissue. And that 6 examples would be tendons, ligaments, bone, cartilage, blood, and adipose. Adipose tissue. Does anybody know what adipose tissue is? Raise your hand. I can't see you. Adipose tissue is fatty tissue. It would be kind of scary if I could see you. Actually, right now you can see me, and that's kind of scary. Epithelial tissue, connective tissue, 3, muscle tissue. There's 3 kinds of muscle tissue. We'll spend quite a bit more time on this when we get up to the muscle unit. Skeletal muscle, skeletal, M for muscle. It's called skeletal because it's attached to bones. Your bones make up your skeletal system. Your skeletal muscle is attached to your bones. It's called skeletal. The muscle cells shorten. They shorten, they pull against the bones. That's what moves your body around. There's cardiac muscle. Where would that be? Hopefully you recognize that would be in your heart. When those cells shorten, they also shorten, they make your heart squeeze and pump the blood. Smooth muscle is in the walls of hollow organs. Blood vessels. And those muscles, when they shorten, they cause the organ to squeeze and push something. It's not pushing blood through your vessels. It's your heart that creates the force that pushes your blood. But your digestive organs, the organs squeeze and push food. 1, 2, 3 kinds of muscle. All 3 are involved with movement and whistling. If you can hear that whistling sound. So you want to associate the idea of movement with muscle tissue. What's the 4th out of 4 types or 4 categories of tissue? Anybody know? We had epithelial, we had connective, we had muscle tissue. 4 is neural tissue, which could also be called nervous tissue. Same thing, neural, nervous. It's involved with communication. One part of your body, like for instance your brain, communicating with other parts of your body. And why do we need the communication? We need it for regulation. When the brain communicates with the heart, it's doing that for the purpose of regulating the heart. Okay, so we're on Roman number 2, the structural design of living things. We've talked about cells, we've talked about tissue.